turn your camera off if you don't want to be on our YouTube channel. So I'd like to welcome everybody tonight on behalf of Breakthrough T1D to our education series presenting information on nutrition and diabetes and calming the post-meal storm. If you've been with us before, you may have noticed that since November of last year, we have a new name, which I just said, Breakthrough T1D. It's a new name, but our same mission. We're a global leader working towards a world free from type 1 diabetes through research, funding, and advocacy. We support people and families in the T1D community from the time of diagnosis by helping those living with T1D to have better, healthier, and safer lives while working to find cures. Our new name is more reflective of the work we do to support anyone with T1D at any age or any stage, including the often underrepresented adult community. I'd like to begin as well by respectfully acknowledging that the Breakthrough T1D Canada National Support Office is located on the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. The education series offers information on a new topic approximately every other month. And next month, we're going to do something a little different, and we're going to be having a lunch and learn with our research department. So we'll be sending some more information about that shortly. And we're really excited to bring a full slate of subjects to you throughout the year. We also host a virtual connection series on the fourth Wednesday of each month. This is an unstructured opportunity to connect with others with no formal programming. And the next connection series will be taking place on Wednesday, February 26th at 12 p.m. Pacific Time and 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Meal planning, nutrition, and knowing how various foods impact blood glucose levels and T1D management can be complicated and often exhausting. We're very excited to be joined tonight by Alana Chambers, registered dietitian, certified diabetes educator, and certified pump trainer for her presentation, Calming the Post-Meal Storm. Tonight, she will explore the factors that impact post-meal glucose levels and share practical solutions, learn how diabetes technologies can help, all while maintaining a healthy and positive relationship with food. Alana Chambers has worked and volunteered in various diabetes settings across the country and now focuses on technology training and education for people living with diabetes and also healthcare professionals. She has been honored to actively work on recent Diabetes Canada initiatives, including the new 2025 Clinical Practice Guidelines updates on glycemic management of type 1 diabetes across the lifespan. Having lived with type 1 diabetes herself for over 30 years, Alana has learned that daily management requires a blend of knowledge and tools, along with creativity, support, and self-compassion. Outside of work, she enjoys spending time with her supportive husband and their 3 adventurous daughters. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Alana.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And a huge thank you to Breakthrough T1D for supporting this session and for, despite having a research focus, understanding the need for our type 1 diabetes community in continuing to learn about how to manage our own type 1 diabetes. So thank you for that. And a huge shout out to everyone who has given up your evening to come in and learn something more about type 1 diabetes. So if you signed up to come here, I'm going to take a pretty good guess that at some point along the way, you've experienced some degree of unpredictability around eating and type 1 diabetes. And when we really stop and think about it, it is a lot like hearing about a big storm in the weather forecast, right? So sometimes if there's a forecast of, let's say, a hurricane, if I can remember my days when I lived out in Halifax, is that hurricane actually going to hit? Or will it be downgraded to a tropical storm? Or if we're really lucky, maybe things are actually going to end up pretty calm, right? With food and type 1 diabetes, we often know that there's something that's going to come into play in those next couple of hours after we eat. And it can be very challenging to anticipate what that's going to look like. Is it going to be a big swing, a big storm that's going to happen? And is that going to be just in that first hour or two after we eat? Or we start to learn over time that, oh, hang on a second, some of these things actually happen several hours after we eat. Maybe we don't notice until the next morning the impact of that dinner meal from the night before. So these things are very normal. thankfully, due to technology, we have learned a lot about the typical responses to different types of foods and meals. And so we have a lot more insights, and we've been able to come up with some better strategies for this, recognizing that one size absolutely does not fit everybody. So as we go through this session tonight, ultimately, I want to shed some light on kind of what are these typical patterns, what are some things we can do about it, and how can we make sure that our meal times don't become so centered around our diabetes and the stress that can come up with what might happen with those blood sugars in that next few hours. Okay, so before I begin, here are my disclosures. I do a lot of work with the different diabetes technology companies, and I am excited to get going with my private practice type 1 journeys coming up here later this spring, with some education opportunities coming up there as well. Also, I just want to remind you that I'm going to have lots of information over this next hour. These are for your information. A lot of these are research findings. Not everything fits everyone the same. So please always speak with your diabetes team before making major changes to your diabetes plan. Okay, so over the next 45 minutes to an hour, I want to make sure we leave time for questions. I want to accomplish two main things. So first, let's look at what those common trends are that happen in that time period after we eat certain types of meals and certain types of foods. And I really want to dive into why these things happen and hopefully normalize this for you so that you realize that you're not the only one that experiences some of these twists and turns with our blood sugars that can send us off on a roller coaster. And then let's talk about some practical solutions, some things that we can do to be a little bit more proactive and help minimize some of these spikes. And some of that's going to involve technology. I do want to ask you, I'm going to talk about different types of technology, and I absolutely recognize everyone uses different modes of insulin delivery. I'm sure there's some people using injections, some on pumps, some on automated systems, but I am going to do my best to try to cross-apply how to use those strategies with different systems. So just listen along, because I will try to translate that as we go. So with that, I want to start by talking about our latest technology. Our automated insulin delivery pump systems, or what we've called hybrid closed loop, and there's a few different names for it. But there's no doubt that this has become the new standard of care around the world. I've been very fortunate over the last couple of years to work on our new Diabetes Canada guidelines for type 1 diabetes, soon to be published. But what we did see very, very clearly, you're not going to be surprised with what we see, because it was very evident that we have significant glycemic benefits to using these systems across the lifespan for people living with type 1 diabetes. And it's not just glycemic benefits. We also see improved quality of life and some relief of that daily management burden. So really, really incredible technology. Now, I do recognize, though, that not everybody has access to this technology yet, and not everybody wants to use it yet. You might not be comfortable. You may not want to wear a pump, and that's okay as well. But that is where the future is headed. So I want to just shed a little bit of light on this to begin with. So this is one of many, many, many studies that looks at at these types of systems and how effective they may be. And I've chosen one that is actually our toughest age group, which is our very young children. And on the top here, what we see are those using a closed loop system in red. And the blue line here underneath is those using either a regular insulin pump without automation or using multiple daily injections. And on this particular graph, we're looking at time in range. So a higher number is better in this situation. We're aiming to get as close to this 70% as possible or higher. Now, what we see when people put on an automated system from night one, that overnight glucose improves nearly instantaneously. People talk about, oh my goodness, I'm waking up in target almost every single day. So you're sleeping, there's not a lot of other factors that come into play. These systems do a really, really beautiful job at keeping those morning glucose levels consistent because we're sleeping at night. Now, what happens during the day? So we can see here that we're still improving that time in range significantly compared with those not using the automated system, but it still is really challenging to reach that 70% goal that we're trying to get at. And what's different from the day than the night, right? During the day, we have so many other factors that come into play. primarily, what are we doing? We're eating, and we're moving, or we're not moving, or our activity levels are fluctuating. And those two things absolutely contribute to glycemic variability. And those things are really challenging to manage. So even when we have a system working in the background, trying really, really hard to get that glucose back up to target, even then it struggles to get to that 70%. Now, I'll recognize that it's taking some of the work off the person. It's the system's doing some of the the corrections and the adjustments, compared with, all of that being put on the person, whether you're on injections or a pump. But still, we do see that these meal times continue to pose some challenges. So I've done quite a bit of talking here to begin with. So I would love to hear from the chat right now. I'd love you to type in what you feel is one of the most frustrating pieces that come along with managing food and type 1 diabetes. And I'm not after a specific food yet at this point. What I'm looking for is just something that bugs you. Okay. What's frustrating to you? And I'm going to read these out as they come. I know for me, I've lived with type 1 for almost 30 years. I went to university to become a dietitian, and I still get frustrated by things that come along with food and diabetes. Calculating carbs, you got it. Food and exercise timing, Victoria, absolutely. Food, snacks, right? Consistency. Can imagine every time we sit down at the table just having to think about, what am I going to do with this, or what's going to happen to my blood sugar 2 to 3 hours after I'm hearing. Carb counting, no predictability, remembering to pre-bolus. Oh my goodness, so many good things in here. Not having the carb count in a restaurant food, absolutely. Judy's saying waking up to a high overnight, glucose spikes, so many great things in here, absolutely. And look at this chat exploding. I love this, because what does this tell us, guys? We are not the only ones that experience these frustrations after we eat. When we are stuck with having to self-dose our insulin every time we put food to our mouths, there's a lot of challenges that come with it. And we are far from having all of the answers on this, but absolutely there are a few things that we can do. Thank you so much for your participation. Feel free to keep adding. Waking up to a CGM alarm. Oh my goodness, yes. So good. Lots of good things in there. Okay, so a lot of what I'm hearing in here is that there's a lot of unpredictability. And a lot of this does tend to come from the fact that there's a lot of factors that impact whether or not that insulin dose that we're giving is going to give us that anticipated glycemic response, right? So I'm going to guess that most of you at some point along the way have been taught how to carb count in some way or another. You've probably been taught to take that carb count, factor that in with what your current blood sugar is, and that's going to give you a beautiful number of units that should magically bring your glucose back down to target eventually. But then over time, you start to realize, hang on a second, if I'm actually having a different amount of protein, or I'm having something a little bit higher in fat, I'm getting a little bit of a different result, and you may start to see a pattern. Maybe you notice the timing of your insulin dose and you realize that rapid acting insulin is actually a little bit slow. Different levels of activity. Someone was commenting about that in the chat. Maybe that time of day comes into play for you. And then you have all of these other factors, things like the glycemic index, the composition of the food, trying to remember to subtract our fiber, stress, different people cooking, different food brands. Now you've got other things like illness and the menstrual cycle coming into play. We have all of these things that really make this super complicated. And it's not surprising that this very basic formula that we were maybe taught at diagnosis doesn't always work out the way that we expected it. And this is not an exclusive list. We could keep adding to this list for sure. But I think that this underscores that, yeah, it's no surprise that we'll feel frustrated. And certainly when we sit down at the table to figure out what that mealtime insulin dose is going to be, it feels a lot like this. Right? I know I feel like this sometimes. There's all of these different levers that we could pull. And here's this little Angela, Robert Munch. We love Robert Munch in my house. Little Angela in this story attempting to fly an airplane as a young kid with no training, no experience. Clearly, there's the potential for a catastrophic outcome for her taking the wheel there. And that's really kind of what it can feel like for us. We have this enormous responsibility placed on our shoulders to figure out something as specific as an insulin dose. When we didn't go to medical school, right, we're not being monitored in an intensive medical unit. The weight is on our shoulders, and that feels really heavy sometimes. And there's many days where we just feel like, I just hope I don't end up crashing, right? I don't want to end up like this. And, and sometimes though, we get caught up in thinking that we're striving for that perfect CGM curve. We want to aim for perfection, but is that realistic? Not really, right? We're bound to hit some turbulence along the way. There's going to be bumps, there's going to be ups and downs. So my goal really here tonight is let's aim to agree that we're going to try to achieve a smoother ride and a bit of a softer landing, not a perfect one, right? And there's definitely some strategies we can use and technology that can help us along the way. And why this is so important is that we absolutely have to continue to prioritize what's important at a mealtime. We should be able to experience joy in our eating. When we're sitting down with our family, with our loved ones, with our friends, we know that eating is meant to be a joyful experience, a time of connection. And we do not want diabetes to hijack that experience. There's evidence to support that in the long run, our nutritional status actually suffers when we take that away. So that's such a critical thing. Parents of young kids with diabetes, this is so important that kid is allowed to be the kid at the table, and it's not just the diabetes, but us as adults as well. Absolutely. So let's dive into kind of what some of these common storms are so that we can start unpacking them and coming up with some strategies. So the first storm I have now named the tornado. All right, so a tornado is fast, it's aggressive, it can do a lot of damage in a short time period. And this is that big post-meal spike. Very, very commonly, this is caused by high glycemic index foods, sometimes just a really heavy carb load. Could be from a delayed meal bolus, or maybe that insulin dose, that carb ratio just isn't quite doing what it's supposed to be doing. Now, those are the common causes. I don't know about you. Maybe give me a thumbs up if you've ever experienced this when you feel like all you do is look at a plate of food, right? So sometimes this comes out of the blue and unexpectedly, but many times it's related to one of those. Sometimes we also get a low in that delayed time period later. The second storm I'm going to talk about, I'm calling this tsunami. So if you know anything about a tsunami, you know that early on that sea might actually be quite calm, and then in comes that big wave. And that's what we very commonly see happen with a lot of our high fat, high protein foods. You think of our typical pizza restaurant foods where we think we're doing okay for a while, and then boom, up goes that blood sugar. And we really do have our continuous glucose monitors to thank for really learning a lot more about these effects. Because I know when I was a kid with type 1 diabetes, we'd have a pizza dinner and go to bed at night, maybe somewhere in around here, thinking, hey, yeah, I did pretty good. And then wake up the next morning with a blood sugar of 20 and think, what did we do wrong? It was my fault. What was wrong with that? And now we've certainly been able to look back and go, okay, we can see that pattern. We can see what's happening. All right, so we're going to start with the tornado. I would love to hear in the chat box here, what foods send your blood sugar into this spike like a tornado? What are some common foods you have here? Rice, yes. Oatmeal, ramen, rice, white rice, pasta, toast. No one has said breakfast cereal. That's what it is for me. Breakfast cereal always. Yeah, Cheerios. Someone got the Cheerio ice cream bagels. So all these really carb heavy meals. Sweet potato, even though that's supposed to be low glycemic index, still shoots some people up. Yeah, lots of really, really good suggestions in here. And so there's different foods impact everybody a little bit differently, but this is a frustrating one to deal with. I think the hardest thing about this tornado is that you see the blood sugar go up and then it comes back down. And very often it actually does come back down to target. So if we were to add more insulin and say, well, why don't I give more insulin for breakfast? Well, then, this blood sugar that's in range ends up being a low, and that's frustrating. So what can we really do about this? So there's three main factors that we really want to look at for kind of calming that big spike that can happen. One is looking at the carb quantity, and that's how we're counting the carbs and also how many carbs we're actually having. Then there's looking at the quality of the carbohydrates. Sometimes I think we've become over fixated on carb counting that we forget about it's not just the number of carbs, it's the quality of it. The more processed a food is, obviously, the faster it's going to send that blood sugar up. Not always true. There are some foods that should be low glycemic index that for some people still do cause that spike. So it's a little bit of trial and error there. And then I really want to make sure we save some time to talk about insulin dose timing, which is probably the most important piece to this puzzle. But let's start with carb counting. Okay. And contrary to what I would have said when I graduated from dietetics school many years ago, we have absolutely learned that carb counting does not need to be perfect. Some of you may have learned carb counting in the days where we taught everyone to be very precise with their carb counting, because all of a sudden our insulin pumps had a way to enter in grams of carbohydrate by the gram, and you could calculate out a very precise insulin dose down to a decimal point. So if we could be more accurate, why not be more accurate, right? But what we've learned over time is that it actually is okay to have some error. Because I just showed you that earlier slide with all of the bubbles. There are so many other factors that influence that insulin dose. So that estimation, you can have about a 20% error and still end up with a glucose level somewhere in that target range that you were aiming for many, many people. This isn't true for every meal type, but generally speaking, that's what we're looking at. We've also learned that people who count in that single gram increment, so no rounding, let's count to the gram, they're actually not more accurate at carb counting than people who've learned to round and estimate in those 10 to 15 gram increments, which is actually how I was taught when I was diagnosed. We had food groups and everything was 15 grams for a starch or 15 grams for a fruit. And we kind of rounded everything because we didn't have labels on everything. And this is such an important skill to learn, because what I worry about is when we overemphasize that perfection with the carb counting, it can be easy to go, well, hang on a second. I'm not comfortable reaching for the fresh fruit because I'm not quite sure what the carb count is. It might feel easier to reach for a packaged snack like a granola bar because the carb count is on there and you feel like you're giving the right insulin dose for it. So especially if you're new to this, I encourage you to kind of step out of your comfort zone sometimes and be okay with giving an estimate, eating those fresh fruits, trying to enjoy it, and learning from it as you go. We're so lucky now to have smartphones on us at all times. So, I mean, I live in the Okanagan during fruit season. I often forget and I'll Google, fresh cherries. How many is it again while we're out picking fruit? And I can kind of make an estimate roughly based on that. But that skill to estimate is so incredibly important. And the really good news I want to share with you is that we are seeing less and less emphasis on carb counting as our technology advances. So our automated insulin delivery pump systems, we are seeing that we can have even more room for error, because the very nature of those systems is that they're automating that delivery of basal insulin, some of them even giving correction doses, both ways, increasing and decreasing that insulin to make up for some of that error in the carb counting. So there's different numbers thrown around on what accuracy. Maybe it can account for 20 grams, 30 grams, kind of depends on the system and depends on the meal. But that is a huge thing for many of us, and I think it represents a lot of hope. There's definitely the day coming where we'll be able to put in small, medium, large meal, and where really we'll be teaching about just being aware of carbohydrates. What foods have carbs in them? Which foods have lots and which foods have a little? And that should be really enough to just prompt these systems and then let them take the workload off of us. So that's a really positive thing. So I want to give an example here of another reason if you're not quite convinced yet. And isn't this funny? Here's the dietitian telling you not to sweat your carb counting too much, but there's so much truth to this. So even the best carb counter You may take different types of foods and completely drive yourself crazy because it may lead to a very different result. So this particular study, everything's very controlled. They're weighing, they're measuring the food. So they've got 3 portions, each with 42 grams of carbohydrate. And they give these insulin doses in the same way, and, very controlled study. And what they found here was that, guess what? All three of these foods gave a different result. And if we superimpose them on each other, we absolutely can see this very clearly. And in this situation, it was a much higher glucose peak with the white rice than with the pasta or the high protein pasta. And the moral of this study is not don't eat white rice. It's different foods give different results. And actually, if we look at this even further, different people respond differently to different foods as well. And there are a lot of things we're still learning, even things about, for example, the microbiome, and other factors that may come into play with some of these different responses as well. So I just want you to ease off some of that pressure a little bit and realize that we can't control everything. Because as I said, that carb counting is just one piece of the puzzle. And sometimes it doesn't make sense and we can get frustrated, but we need to kind of look bigger picture on this. And are there some other things that maybe we can look at? Now, some people get so frustrated by this. I love this little cartoon. It made me laugh so hard when I saw it. And this can get frustrating. You're like, you know what? Forget it. Why not just leave the carbs out? They are too challenging. They send my blood sugar in different directions all of the time. We've definitely seen the low carb diet trend trickle into the type 1 diabetes space. And again, as we have more people using glucose sensors, what people tend to notice pretty quickly is that, hey, guess what? My blood sugar doesn't spike quite so much after I eat when I don't eat as many carbs. And a lot of people do, in fact, notice that and see that. And I'm not talking necessarily about going full on no carbohydrates in this situation, but we're seeing this trend towards maybe just having a little less carbohydrate. Of course, as a dietitian and many of us in the healthcare world, we always wanting to look at, well, are there risks? What are the risks and benefits of that? So the Better Registry out in Quebec last year published this study where they had a large cohort of Canadian adults with type 1 diabetes, and they stratified them by how much carbohydrate they typically eat. So kind of comparing the high carb eaters to the moderate carb to the lower carb eaters. Again, low carb eaters weren't no carb, it was just lower carb in their diets. Now, as a whole, though, I do want to highlight that they did find that regardless of how many carbs they typically eat, everyone was a little low on fiber, a little too high on fat, and a little bit high in saturated or animal fat. So they did have this conclusion that we really do need to make sure that we're not forgetting about nutrition quality in type 1 diabetes. And I think a lot of this comes from the fact that we've just been so fixated on carbs for so long. But what they did notice was that those people who ate the lowest carb, they actually were in fact more likely to reach that target A1C. Very similar to what I've kind of heard people talking about, over the years. They are getting that positive result, and I think that keeps them following that meal pattern. Unfortunately, though, this did come at a bit of a cost. They did find that their diet quality did diminish a little bit with this. And what they found was that they weren't eating as many fruits and grains. So that's not overly surprising given that those are carb foods. They had a lot more milk and more meats and alternatives and higher intakes of all types of fat. Thankfully, there were no changes in risks to lows or hypoglycemia, and in the short term, no major issues with their lipid profiles or their cholesterol levels, which is something that we really do want to watch for in the long term, especially with our cardiovascular health. So really, to me, the takeaway to this study is that if you are finding that you want to lean more to lower carb food choices or a lower carb diet, just be mindful of what you're replacing those carbohydrates with. Don't wait until you're sitting down at the table and you're choosing not to have the rice and you're going to have second portions of the meat or some of the other rich foods that are there. We don't want our dinner to become a charcuterie board, right? What we want to make sure is that we think about that proactively and think, okay, if the carbs are coming out, I'm still going to be hungry. We still need to fuel our bodies. Are there some plant-based proteins that we can add in? Some nuts, some seeds, some legumes? How can we get a little bit more creative? Upping the vegetables, not being afraid of some carbs, some fruits, some whole grains. But it's just that's something to be very mindful of in that situation, okay? Now, if this isn't for you, it definitely doesn't have to be. There's, like I say, no one size fits all approach here. But a really, really critical piece to, I think, managing any type of carbohydrate and any type of mealtime insulin dose is paying close attention to the timing of that insulin dose. We know, oh, I just had a question in the chat. How many carbs is low carb? In that particular study, it was about 130 grams of carbs a day on average. Okay, so that was that study. And we see a wide range though, for sure. Okay, so just back to our mealtime insulin dose timing. So what we've learned is that our rapid acting insulin, guess what? I don't want to give this punchline away. I think we all know it. It's not that rapid. And so when we give our insulin, either at the start of the meal is kind of this peachy colored line here, or if we give the insulin after we eat, surprisingly, actually, it gives a pretty similar result. We still end up with a fairly significant post-meal spike. And it's really interesting to reflect on this and think, okay, this isn't a study. This is in a controlled setting. In the real world, when we get stuck in a situation like this, I know I've certainly been tempted when I hit this peak here to be frustrated and give more insulin than maybe I should, that may then send me on a roller coaster down to a low later, right? So there's other consequences that come with that spike. And is it easier to actually be a little bit more proactive with this and try giving that insulin earlier? Because what they see is that when these participants were given their insulin 20 minutes before they ate, look at the profound difference in that blood glucose profile after the meal. It's hugely different. But it's when I really reflect on that, like, how does this now feel when it's an hour and a half, 2 hours after dinner, and that blood sugar is staying in range, and you don't feel, oh my gosh, my blood sugar is high. Should I give a correction? Should I not give a correction? Especially if it's in the evening. That really eliminates a lot of frustration. And when I think about what happens in that moment, that actually, to me, is a much stronger selling point than, hey, I should give my insulin earlier just to make things smoother. It's like, actually, no, I want to give my insulin sooner because that makes my evening feel a little less stressful after dinner, for example. And what's amazing about this strategy is that we don't even have to think about the insulin dose itself. I'm not telling you try calculating, more or less, or tweaking a carb ratio or tightening up the carb counting. This is just by changing the timing of the insulin dose. It's a pretty powerful thing. For me, when I was in my pre-pregnancy planning before my first daughter, this was the one thing I did that really made the biggest impact. And I do see that kind of across the board with many people that are really trying to get to target for various reasons. Prioritizing this meal dose timing is nearly instantly successful for most people. Now, I also do recognize, again, I mentioned this is a study. This doesn't always represent real life. So what if your blood sugar wasn't, kind of in range and there's a bit of a buffer here? They're kind of running in the eights. What if you were low? What if you were high? Is this still going to work the same way? So I do think we have to acknowledge that there are some factors that we do have to consider with this. So if we consider that for most balanced meals where there's a bit of carb, a bit of protein, a bit of fat, a 20-minute pre-meal bolus, if you're kind of in range, is going to be effective for most people. But there are some situations where you might not want that full 20 minutes, where you may wait and give that dose a little bit closer to the meal. And these you really have to kind of learn from your own patterns from, but definitely if that glucose is already low or it's dropping quickly, maybe you're eating a low glycemic index food, a food that really doesn't spike that blood sugar up very much. Well, then maybe we don't have to worry about it quite so much. Maybe you've noticed you're really sensitive to insulin. for a particular reason. And we definitely do see this with our ultra rapid acting insulin. So for example, like Fiasp, you may be able to get away with giving it much closer to that mealtime. But there's also, some truth on the other side of the pendulum as well. There's some situations where we actually might need to give that bolus more than 20 minutes before we eat. If your glucose is already high, or if it's high and it's double arrowing up at the same time, we need to give that insulin some time to work. Just giving 20 minutes, you're still going to see that glucose climb a little bit. So it's kind of figuring that out a little bit. Same thing with a really high glycemic index food, something like a breakfast cereal where you shoot straight up. Maybe you've tried a 20-minute pre-bolus and that still doesn't do the job. So you want to keep backing that up until you kind of find that magic window that works for you. Insulin resistance is a big one. So again, I've mentioned the morning. Many people have more insulin resistance in the morning, and they may need a bit of a different bolus window for the morning than they do for their lunch or their supper. Certainly pregnancy, that third trimester, a lot of women end up bolusing long before 20 minutes before their meal. So kind of the moral of the story here is follow your own glucose patterns. Start with the 20 minutes. There may be situations where you do more or less, and see what happens. Use your CGM. If you don't have regular access to a CGM, see if you can at least get a sample to put on for 10 days and play with this a little bit so that you can learn what works out for you. Now, I also want to be realistic and acknowledge that sometimes it just doesn't happen, right? Somebody put that in the chat at the very beginning, remembering to pre-bolus. I've got 3 kids. There's nights where I'm lucky I get dinner on the table, let alone remember to get in a pre-meal bolus. So what are some other strategies that you could try when you're in that moment and you realize that pre-meal bolus didn't happen? Oh, here's someone that was asking, well, while you're writing in the chat, gastroparesis, that's exactly why I say look at your own patterns, because chances are absolutely you would go low, right? So you want to see where does that glucose tend to rise in you and work your insulin dose around your specific pattern. Yeah. Anyone have any suggestions here for the group on what else we can do to kind of mimic that? Okay. So we want to think about the fact that our rapid acting insulin takes at least about 15 minutes to start working, 90 minutes to really peak. So there's some great suggestions in here about maybe eating your carbohydrate last, eating the protein first. Ooh, a temp bolus. So trying to give a little bit more. That's interesting. Exercise, veggies. Okay, you guys got, I think, almost all of the ones that I came up with on this list. So I'd said, if you have the flexibility to delay your meal, we don't always, but that can work. So if you have flexibility, say for a lunch break, maybe have that lunch a little bit later today if you missed it. There is a really neat study out there on looking at the order of our foods. So eating those carbohydrate containing foods last. And that's essentially creating like a pre-bolus. Filling up on the protein and the fat, or adding protein and fat, will slow down the digestion. If you have the flexibility to change the types of foods, more low glycemic index, maybe going lower carb could help out if you, again, have that flexibility. Do not underestimate the power of exercise. 10 minutes of exercise, a short burst of exercise after eating, has an incredibly powerful glucose lowering effect, especially when we've got insulin on board. So that is a really, really critical one that's very effective. And also, let's not forget about just having some forgiveness for yourself, right? And anticipating, okay, you know what? It was a tough morning. The pre-bolus didn't happen. The high is going to come. I'm going to, anticipate it. I know I gave insulin. It will come back down. Take a deep breath and we'll try again tomorrow. And that is okay. I have mornings like that too. Okay. So that's totally normal. Okay. All right. So let's get into our tsunami now. And this is probably one of the things that made you sign up to come to this session, because you wanted an answer for something like pizza, right? So these are these delayed highs that tend to happen after those challenging restaurant type meals. So let's come back to the chat here, and I'd love to hear about some of the foods that send your blood sugar into this kind of tsunami, this tsunami pattern where you get this delayed high blood sugar. Pizza. Oh, that's the first thing. That's what I expected. Pizza, chili, fish and chips. That's a great one. Yep. Anything kind of Chinese food, Spätzle, gnocchi. Yes, Chinese food. I always find anything that's really saucy, greasy, cheesy. Carol says mac and cheese. Yep. Deep fried. Those are those foods that are really challenging, and they often catch up with us many, many hours after we eat them. Lots of pastas here, especially a pasta with a creamy sauce tends to really do it. So let's look at why this happens. So when we look at fat, fat delays our gastric emptying. So most of you, I'm sure, can imagine what it's like after we eat a high-fat meal. You feel that meal sitting in the pit of your stomach, often for quite a while after you eat. And that's that digestion being slowed down. Okay, so those carbs aren't actually being absorbed immediately or not as quickly as when we eat something where we have normal digestion. We also see insulin resistance happening when we eat higher amounts of fat as well. And so what this leads to is you actually may experience a low in that early post-meal time period because the food's not actually, the carbs aren't hitting the system. And then you get this rise once everything starts to digest, but you've got that insulin resistance. So when we try and throw some insulin at it, it just doesn't work out as well. And that's where we get frustrated. Now, protein, we do have some amount of glucose that is made from the amino acids of the protein itself. And then we also see some glucagon secretion from the liver. And so what we tend to see is that when we have large amounts of protein, and this could even be from like a big steak dinner, or sometimes if we're making like a protein shake, let's say, for example, a large amount of protein, we see this late and sustained rise in high blood sugars. So when we put the two of these together with something like a restaurant meal, we really see this delayed, sustained high blood sugar. And I can clearly remember looking at the early research on this before we had widespread use of CGMs, and us learning that, when we have something that's low in protein and low in fat, that blood sugar goes up and then it comes back down. But as soon as we added in high protein, guess what? The blood sugar this is 3 to 5 hours after the meal, it stayed up a little bit higher. Same thing happened when we added just high fat. That blood sugar kind of stayed up a little bit higher. But when we add the two together, it truly is an additive effect. And we see that blood sugar go up and stay up for 3 to 5 hours. And then they stopped, almost all of these studies, they stopped around the 5 hour mark. If we didn't do something about that, then that high would have continued all night or for several hours until it was corrected and brought down. And so we see this very clearly when we look at all of our different CGM and pump reports now, but that's a very, very normal response. And again, this is a study. With some restaurant foods, I see much, much larger excursions than in this kind of controlled study environment. So there's some things that we can do about this. We can consider adding some extra insulin, either by injection or by pump. We have extended boluses that we can play with on pumps. Definitely using our CGMs to watch for that rise and maybe having an alert if it's high or if it's low. Automated insulin has really changed the game for this. This is why we're seeing less in the research about this today, because we're seeing that we're having a lot of that added stress kind of relieved. And then there's always just adapting based on the patterns that we're seeing. So I'm going to start out by talking about the extended bolus with our insulin pumps, with my promise to show you how this also works with automation and with injections. So an extended bolus, these have been around in our insulin pumps for many, many years. And what it allows us to do is split up our insulin dose so that we can give a first wave of our insulin dose up front to cover those rapidly absorbed carbohydrates. So that's just like giving an injection. It goes in all at once. But then we can have the remainder of the dose spread over time to cover those slowly absorbed carbs, the fat, and the effects of the protein as well. And this, in theory, can do a really beautiful job of trying to match that absorption of some of these challenging foods. But a big question I always get is, how should we split the dose? And there's not really an easy answer for that, because we know that not every meal is the same, especially when we're eating out. Some restaurants are higher protein, some are higher fat, some are all sorts of blends of things. We also know very, very, very clearly that no one person is the same. Every single study that I have read on high fat and high protein foods shows massive variability in responses from person to person. So if we were sitting in a room together, I'd get you to ask the person next to you what happens with them with one food versus another, and you'd probably get very different responses. Some common themes, but when we really look at it closely, it's very different. And we also can appreciate that right when we think we have figured something out, no one day with diabetes is the same because we have other factors that influence this as well. But there are kind of some common findings. So in this study here, they set out to really find, is there an optimal way to split this insulin dose? So what they actually found was that people did best when they had at least 60% of their insulin dose given in that initial time period. So if this was a 10-unit bolus, for example, we would want at least 6 of those units given, at the meal time or 15 minutes before. Pulling back on that too much led to high blood sugars that then you just had to keep chasing. And so then it's frustrating for that reason. So we want to minimize that initial spike. But then what they found was people needed up to 70% of that dose as an extended bolus to prevent that delayed high. So if you're thinking that the math is a little bit wonky on that slide, it absolutely is, because this is one of the first studies that I can remember coming across that showed us that, guess what? We actually need extra insulin beyond what we would calculate with a carb count to cover off the effects of high fat and high protein foods. So this continued to get built on. So later we saw this study come out, high fat, high protein breakfasts in kids. So they went with this, let's give 60% up front, let's give 40% over 3 hours and see what happens. But then let's try increasing that calculated dose. Anywhere from 100 would be just their normal dose to up to 60% more. And let's see what happens. And what they found was that 100%, so this is just the normal dose here, they did end up still with significant highs. On the flip side, 160% was, as much as this looks like this line wins, these participants actually got quite a few lows. So the winner in this study was giving 140% of the dose. And that was for this particular study breakfast. So we may get a different response with a different food, but really, really interesting. And when I really reflect on this, what I often think about is, that sounds like a lot of extra insulin and it sounds a little bit scary. I would never recommend giving that much, right off the bat. But when we think about if we did nothing, do we end up with a high blood sugar here? And how much extra correction insulin would we have ended up having to give ourselves anyways? So if we see this pattern where that blood sugar is always going high later, can we be proactive with that? And that's really what we're trying to get at here. Now, thank you for those of you on injections. I promised you that I would apply this to you as well. So when we have these types of high fat, high protein meals, you can do something similar to mimic what we do on a pump. So you could consider, if you do notice you tend to get that low by giving the full dose all at once up front, you could consider giving a little less insulin with the mealtime, and then adding in a second shot in that postprandial time period to kind of mimic what that extended bolus is doing. Of course, adapting based on what you see. And I'll share just one quick study here on this. This is a small study. This is just a high fat meal. And what they found, I know we're getting tight for time, so I'm going to focus on just this red line was actually where they gave 30% extra insulin to those people who had the high fat meal, and they gave it 3 hours later. And that led to less of a spike than this black line is when they did nothing at all. So really helped to minimize that rise without causing a low, giving that extra dose 3 hours later. So something to think about if you haven't yet. And again, it's if this black line is the pattern that you tend to see and you end up having to give this correction every time you have pizza, a few hours later, then do we just back that up a little bit to where your rise tends to happen and start considering maybe a little extra insulin? Now, how about our automated insulin delivery systems? This is where it's been really fun to see what these can do. So here's Medtronic's 780G insulin pump system. You can see that they're putting in 60 grams of carb for a pizza lunch. Here goes the dose. These pink lines here represent the basal, which the system is automatically kind of calculating and delivering. So right after this individual had this pizza, it actually completely pulled back on the basal to prevent that early drop in the blood glucose. And then once the blood sugar started to climb up, you can see that basal ramping up. And then at some point here, as it's continuing to climb, it's spitting out these are auto-correction doses here to help minimize that spike, and does a really beautiful job. Here's another quick example of Tandem's Control IQ, where they were able to give, here's a 6-unit bolus for a pizza night, and gave it split actually as a 50-50 split in this situation. And by extending that bolus out, they minimized having a drop in that short time period, which the system may or may not have caught. And then what we see happening as the blood sugar comes up later in the evening, it also added in some auto-correction boluses. And it's really interesting to look at how much. Look at this, 3.8 units in addition to that 6-unit bolus. So more than 50% is actually what this system gave in that situation to cover off that pizza, and then and then those basal modulations overnight to bring them back down to range in the morning. Now, those are two really, those look like simple examples. It does not always turn out that perfect every single time. Sometimes you still do get a swing with an automated system, but eventually it does work to bring that glucose back down to target. So just to kind of summarize this session, I covered a lot in a short time period on high fat and high protein. That kind of all of the evidence together tells us that when we're having a high fat meal or a moderately high fat meal with high protein, that is when we need to consider making an adjustment. Now, there are, rules here for how many grams of fat and how many grams of protein, but I just like to use the rule of thumb is it higher in fat and higher in protein than what you normally eat? So if I typically have, 1 serving of a protein with my dinner, and tonight I'm hungry and we're having a big portion, or that restaurant meal is double what I normally eat, then I know I need to do something about it. This is a cheesier meal than normally, a saucier meal than normal. I'm probably going to have to do something about this. And these meals typically require, as I've showed, extra insulin and given over an extended time period, not necessarily all at that meal time. You do want to work this out slowly. So this is a really wonderful thing to go back to your dietitian, your diabetes team, and go, listen, I want to figure out my pizza from my local neighborhood pizza place. I'm going to try ordering it kind of a couple weekends in a row and playing with some different strategies, and come back and talk to them and see what worked and what didn't work, and just keep that conversation flowing. I do want to express some caution here. Be careful when we're playing with adding in extra insulin, especially if we have varying amounts of carbs. Maybe if your insulin dose settings aren't quite optimized, but especially these last two things, exercise and alcohol, tend to definitely have a delayed lowering effect on our glucose levels. So I often think of those as almost canceling out the effects of fat and protein in the long run. So please use caution there if you're adding in extra doses. And, a final reminder, I've said this many, many times, but do not forget that one thing you read on the internet, or one thing that maybe I said tonight, may or may not apply to you. Use your own glucose patterns as your guide, and just keep on tweaking as you see what worked and what didn't work. And as you do go through all of this, I remind you to please, please, please not be too hard on yourself. Self-compassion is such an important piece that comes along with self-managing type 1 diabetes. It is not always going to be perfect. I've got fellow colleagues that live with type 1 who are also dietitians, and I love it when we sit out to eat together in a restaurant, because we all have a different strategy and we all get wildly different results, and it is not perfect every time. So this stuff is challenging. Cut yourself some slack, because we do see that is such an important thing for our mental health in the long run, but actually even for, improvement of our long-term glycemia and our diabetes management, we do better when we're a little easier on ourselves. So that little nugget to remind you of at the end here. So in summary, before questions, we talked about that tornado, those big glucose spikes, keep in mind, the quality of the carbohydrate you're eating. Think about how many carbs you're having at a time and how we're counting those. And if you want the biggest bang for your buck to go home, think about the timing of that meal dose, keeping in mind that it's at least 15 minutes for that rapid acting insulin to even start working for most people. Those high fat, high protein foods often do need a little extra insulin and over an extended time period. There's definitely hope in our future with what we're seeing technology be able to do. So keep an eye on new automated insulin delivery pump systems as they continue to advance. They absolutely are relieving more and more of that burden from us. And just acknowledge that this is not easy. So have realistic goals, get somebody to help you out with this, talk it through with family members, with friends, whoever the supporters are in your circle, and celebrate successes along the way when you get them, because it's not easy. So I'll open this up to questions. Thank you so much for listening. I'm just, as I mentioned, in the process of getting up and running with my practice and some education with Type 1 Journeys is my business name. So I do have an opt-in form on my website there. If you pop in there now, I will keep you up to date as things become available there. But for now, I'm happy to stick around for some questions.
Wow. Thank you so much, Alana. I was just sitting here like listening, feeling like I was in university lecture. I learned so much from you. That was really fantastic and delivered with such enthusiasm as well, which I'm extremely appreciative of. I can see some people are responding to each other in the chats, and unfortunately, I don't think Alana can speak directly to someone's individual Medtronic pump and how it works, but I would suggest talking to your healthcare provider about it and letting them know some of the issues you're having with it. But I did see a question from Bev. I hope I pronounced that correctly. On multiple daily injections. Oh my God, the chat's going so fast. I just lost it. Sorry.
It is going fast. I love it.
How long after a meal that a regular dose was given and you spike, are you basically staying high? Would you give a correction dose?
Yeah, so that one study I showed, and it was a small study, and it was just high fat, not high protein. Okay, but that's kind of the one I had to work with. They waited for 3 hours after the meal to give that second dose, and that worked well for those people. But as I said, what you really want to do is see what your typical pattern is. So if you can look at your CGM curve and see, okay, when do I tend to rise? And if you back that up and think, okay, our insulin tends to peak at about 90 minutes. So if you think kind of 90 minutes before, you tend to see that spike to keep ahead of it. That kind of is the magic rule. But somewhere in that 2 to 3 hour post-meal window is probably where you're going to land, most people. And start small.
Jen asked about her 20-month-old daughter who's type 1, how long to wait to correct and not stack. I'm not sure if this is,
yeah, no, that's it. That stacking of insulin in that post-meal time period is definitely a scary thing, because you're going, okay, the blood sugars went high. Do I need to give more or do I not? What I would highly recommend is if you're not using some type of a bolus calculator, and this doesn't have to be a pump, you can use a meal dose calculator app. There's a couple of them out there. So talk to your healthcare team. I'd want to make sure you use one that takes into account the insulin action time for a very young child. But then what those apps will do, like an insulin pump, is keep track of how much insulin is still working, because our insulin kind of has a curve on it. So we want to have an idea of, okay, if it's 2 hours after, how much of that insulin dose is still left, and make sure we're taking that into account. So I would definitely talk to your care team about getting some help in calculating out insulin on board with an app, or there's some charts out there on that too. Great question.
I saw a question about adjustments if you're very insulin sensitive.
Adjustments if you're very insulin sensitive? Yes. So if you're very insulin sensitive, then you're probably on a low dose of insulin. Our general rule of thumb when we talk about insulin dose adjustment is to move insulin by 10 to 20% at a time. So you'd probably go on the lower end of that. Again, talk with your diabetes team and always start small and work your way up slowly if you're noticing that you need to increase. And same thing on the other side, decrease that dose if you're noticing lows. Always monitoring and adjusting from that.
I see there's one question that if you don't mind, I know we're gonna go like a tiny bit over, Alana, if you're okay.
Oh, that's totally fine.
I just wanted to acknowledge Bernie's comment.
Okay.
and just say that I don't know if there's anything in the works in Atlanta. I don't know if you would know either about being able to put in what type of carbs and fats and that you're eating while you're calculating so that it adjusts based on like more distilled, detailed amount of information. But
Right. The only thing that I have seen that does that so far is actually our do-it-yourself automated insulin pump system. So the Loop app specifically allows you to put in like a pizza bolus, and it does the math. The system does the math for you as far as how it divides up that insulin dose and then adjusts in that period. So that gives me hope because what we've seen happen in that do-it-yourself automated insulin delivery movement is that the diabetes industry is tending to follow what they have done, and it's kind of pushing that pendulum forward. So I do think we will see probably some artificial intelligence maybe even coming into play, but right now there's nothing that does give a firm answer on that. It is challenging though because everyone does respond differently. So sorry, I don't have a clear answer on that today.
and then just the final question from Amy,
Sure.
just if any of the studies looked at different types of fats. She said good versus bad. I think we mean more like saturated versus monounsaturated.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question, Amy. There was thinking for a long time that saturated fats led to a more negative impact on blood glucose than unsaturated fats, so animal versus not animal. That has since actually been proven wrong. So again, it's kind of up in the air right now, but we do not see that clearly. I think it's the amount of fat as a whole that tends to have the biggest impact. Great question.
I think most of the comments now are just thanking you and thanking you for acknowledging and normalizing um, that this is not an exact science. It changes day to day from one day to the next, from one person to the next, and just allowing people to be a little bit easier on themselves, I think, and giving people permission to be kind to themselves is so important. So thank you for doing that in
Oh,
addition to
wonderful.
everything else you did tonight, Milena, which was a lot.
Thank you. Oh,
Um,
thank you for these comments. I so appreciate. I love this. I love this. Life is so much better now. Yeah, it is because it's we can really beat up on ourselves, and it takes, like I said, nothing has been more humbling to me than sitting with fellow healthcare professionals that live with type 1 diabetes and seeing that we still struggle sometimes too. And sometimes it's a lot, right? It's easier said than done, that's for sure. So thank you.
so I just want to remind everyone we'll be sending this out tomorrow by email. And thank you again so much, Alana, for such an excellent presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And I hope you have a good rest of your Tuesday evening.
So thank you. Good
Take
night,
care,
everybody.
everybody.